All right. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the 2020 IFF Boston Fall Focus. Uh, my name is Brian Tam. I'm the Executive Director of IFF Boston, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this Q&A for Sound of Metal, which is our centerpiece film. I'm joined here by Director Darius Marder. We're going to
Hi.
we're going to be talking for a while, and we are also joined by Sophia Stratton, who will be doing ASL interpretation for us. So thanks to her. Thanks to you, Darius. I'm going to be talking to Darius a little bit, but if you're watching this live and you want to ask questions, you can just put them in the comment box to the left there, and we'll get to as many as we can in our time. So with that, I guess we'll get started. So Darius, thanks so much for joining us. This is a movie that I saw at Toronto last year.
Oh, great.
Yeah, and it really struck with me. It was definitely one of the films that I loved the most that I saw last year. We did everything we could to bring it to our main festival in the spring, which did not happen, obviously. So we're very glad that you could join us for our fall program. And I should also thank Amazon Studios for hooking us up with that. So thanks to Amazon. And
Yeah.
thanks Chris Stinson, the producer, who we've worked with for a long time, for also helping us out. So thanks to them.
Chris Stinson's such a dear friend, and it's also very fun to be here, even in this capacity, because we're kind of local.
Yeah, I definitely want to talk about that, because I'm sure some of the people watching us are from the Mass film community. I guess while I'm at it, I should thank the Massachusetts Production Coalition for their help promoting this, and of course the Real Abilities Film Festival Boston. So thanks to them. So much to talk about. I guess the first thing I would want to ask you about is how you got involved with the project. You know, how this idea came about. What was your inspiration?
Well, this project began actually. I have a writing partner, Derek C. in France, who's a phenomenal filmmaker, and we wrote Place Beyond the Pines together. But when we met 13 years ago, the very first thing we talked about was what was the actual seed of this film. And that was a movie that Derek was making called Metalhead, which was kind of a hybrid documentary. It was a beautiful film. It never got completed, but it was a beautiful kind of a film that followed this band Jucifer, Jucifer is a metal band. They're a couple. They live in their case in Winnebago, and they travel endlessly, and they play exceedingly loud music. And Edgar was having some hearing issues, and that was the seed that then became this. I got obsessed with the concept. I got really interested in the kind of codependent aspect of this relationship, and obviously the sound component. And I ended up kind of editing a lot of that footage. And in that time, I was able to play a little, which is really interesting, to precede a writing process by being able to play with this footage that Derek had shot, which was so beautiful and also so instructive. So I was able to play with a sound perspective in a very lo-fi way. And then I just felt, very strongly that it needed to be written. And there was a moment of a handoff, basically, where I took it and I said, I'm going to write this from the ground up. And that was probably 10 years ago. And when that happened, and then so it's been a hike, but that's how it started.
So obviously you've been working on this project for a long time. Did you have any concerns, or what was your process in thinking about kind of setting this story in the world of the deaf and hard of hearing community? Like, what were your concerns? Were there preconceptions you had?
Do you mean concerns about how to do that?
Yeah, I mean,
or whether to?
Yeah, I mean, is it a world that you were familiar with before, or?
Well, first of all, the doc itself dipped into that world, so that was always present. Secondly, I have had some familiarity with that world, less the deaf world with a capital D, and more one of the things that really inspired my brother and I, who my brother ended up co-writing it with me. My grandmother went deaf. She was a cinephile, and she went deaf not late in life. She went deaf from taking an antibiotic. And what happened, she was an incredible woman. She was a gay film lover, really a Jewish woman living in New York, an orphan and an alcoholic. And when she went deaf, she was caught between the deaf world, deaf culture, and the hearing world, because you're cut off from the hearing world all of a sudden. And she lost film, she lost movies. So she fought for the rest of her life, actually, to get movies open captioned, and which is one of the reasons that the film is dedicated to her. So that experience, which actually is quite informative for the character of Ruben, was really in there.
So when you first started writing it, I mean, did you have people in mind? Because this was probably before Riz Ahmed and
was born.
Well, they were certainly not,
no,
they were certainly not working actors at the time. So did you have other people in mind, or?
Oh yeah. Well, there was a real casting odyssey here. I mean, casting was incredibly hard. And yeah, I didn't know anything about Riz when I started casting this film, and or Olivia. And I went through a number of actors before this came together. I almost shot this film many times. It's so hard to make a film like this. And I think we all know, I mean, making independent films is really tough now. And especially a movie like this, because it's really ambitious. And it was, it's my first narrative feature. So that takes a leap of faith from everyone. And, and there's nothing worse than a director saying, I'm going to do something that you've never seen or never heard before, all this kind of stuff. And you're really asking a lot of people to go on that ride. And that's what I was asking of actors. I wasn't just saying, I want, here's a film, here's a script. I was saying, no matter who you are, if you're going to do this movie, you're going to learn to play the drums, and you are going to learn ASL, not just the lines of the movie. You have to be able to improvise in ASL. You have to learn as much ASL as Ruben would have learned in the script, having been immersed in deaf culture in a deaf community for 4 to 6 months. So that's a high ask. That's a high bar. And finding actors, a lot of actors, we talk a lot about process, and that's something people savor, but it also means that you shut off the rest of the world. It means that you don't, piggyback projects. It means that you actually commit to the time it takes to do that. And, that's not so easy. So I had wonderful actors who were interested, but there might've been moments that came where they just simply weren't willing to commit to that kind of process. And Riz is really special. Riz is just, can you imagine, taking 7-8 months to learn drums from scratch and learn ASL? These are two intensely physical, difficult processes. And he was willing to do that, and engage in that, which is what really attracted me to him, among other things.
Were there people who, maybe wanted to do it, but they just couldn't do the commitment? Was it an issue of, you would be right for this, but if you can't commit, we just can't go forward. You can't fake this.
Yep. There was that. I don't think it was usually, there's not a lot of actors who are like, I'm not going to do a process. But I think what it is that I kind of, sometimes my agents and people I knew would try to talk me down from this, because I kind of I believe in scaring people a little bit sometimes as it relates to this, because I think that you have to, if you're not appropriately scared, something's wrong. You have to be willing to step up. And so, I would say, I filmed, like, for instance, the concert in the film, that's filmed at the Middle East in Cambridge. And it's a real club. It's filmed with real music fans, not just music fans, but fans of, industrial music and metal and hardcore and punk. And it's a show, it's a club. And I said, this is what we're going to do. We're going to play a club. We're not going to shoot this like a movie. We're not going to shoot fake land, because there's nothing worse, certainly as a musician, than watching that happen. We've all seen that a lot in movies, like an actor pretending to be a musician. It can be a very painful experience. And so not only did we shoot with a live audience, but normally in films you would shoot shoot the drummer, and then a separate shot, shoot the singer, and then you'd mix it together and you'd make it work. You'd fake it, essentially. And you'd shoot cutaways, so you could fake that too. And so I didn't shoot any cutaways. I shot a lot of shots where you can see the other person in the shot, because you can't fake that. They were playing together. And so I told them that from the beginning. And, so a lot of people don't want to hear that. A lot of people want to know they're safe. They want to know there's a safety net, and there wasn't a safety net.
So there definitely seems a lot of the film that was shot kind of documentary style or influenced by documentary. Was that always the plan? Because of that, was that the plan, that you wanted to put people in the real world and just film them? Or was that always part of the plan, or did that come at some point during the filming or elsewhere?
No, I mean, a lot of the inspiration came during the filming, which is that, a lot of the aspects of deaf culture that are represented on the screen really come from deaf culture, from the deaf community. I didn't write, like the games the kids are playing. That's a very specific elephant game that Lauren Ridloff brought. Much of everything that you see isn't from my mind or my brother's mind, but really from the real world of deaf culture. And it's not us representing it, it's really them representing it. Right. And in that sense, I really wanted, I think when you talk about documentary, you're really talking about the heart in the middle of the film, and where you're kind of like looking in on a culture. And I'm glad you say documentary, because that means it should feel like that, because it's not, otherwise it really is a representation. It's like a framing of something that you're creating. And I'm not creating deaf culture here. That aspect, deaf culture is a very big word, first of all. Mm-hmm. There's many subcultures and subsets of deaf culture. It's too big to even represent. This is just a little fraction of aspects of it that the community and a lot of locals in Boston were gracious enough to kind of allow me into. One aspect of that, like for instance, is the dinner scene in at the deaf community, which is a very loud experience. A lot of banging and the spilling of a drink, and because ASL is very physical, and it's often a surprise for hearing people to come into deaf culture and realize how loud it is. It's a very physical language. It's a very physical existence, and that dinner was very special because, a number of people from the deaf community came to me and said, we've never seen that. We've never seen that captured. That's how we experience dinners. That's how I experienced dinners growing up. But we don't do that in hearing culture. We don't go to restaurants and do that. That's for us. So that was something that was shared with me, and so I really did want to capture that in a way that honored the truth of it,
So there's two questions I want to. Let me start with this one. The talking about kind of the documentary kind of feel again. The beginning of the film is kind of a little bit frantic, around the music. There's like a propulsion to it. Mm-hmm. But then when he kind of comes to this community, the point is obviously for him to kind of slow down, but the film also kind of slows down, and I kind of think it allows us to slow down a little bit. I think there's like a lot of tension that we feel as viewers, because he plays a very aggressive kind of music, and he's very he's under a lot of stress. The way that you have these cutaways to these nature shots, like to the clouds and the trees, that has a very documentary feel, but it also feels, it seems to me that it feels two purposes. One is to kind of demonstrate the process that Ruben's going through to kind of live with stillness. But another way, it seems that to us as viewers to kind of get us into that world as well. And was that a conscious choice that you made, or, to kind of make sure that we of the hearing community kind of start to kind of get into that world a little bit deeper so we can understand it better?
Yeah, it's a beautiful comment because it's utterly on purpose. And the whole, I my brother and I talked about this with the title of the film. The title of the film for us always represented the three acts of the film. So the first act is sound. The middle act is of, and the definition of is being part of a group, And in that act, because it's such a first person movie, it's such a visceral movie, very much on purpose. It's grueling, because you're in that experience, and it is visceral. You're in that hearing perspective, and you don't break from Ruben. So what I was really interested in is how we physically feel a movie, not how we think about it, but how we physically feel it. And because I believe that cinema has that effect on us, and can have that effect when the body is engaged in that way. And it's a very specific kind of language and editing. And I think, a lot of films don't try to do that. But I wanted the viewer of this film to actually go through a physical process with Ruben. And so, exactly to your point, it was very on purpose that the beginning is in urban areas, and it's an urban landscape, and then it merges into a rural landscape for that central piece. And that was very important because the rhythms of nature and the wind, something Lauren Ridloff actually spoke to me about this beautifully, and talked about the ways in which you look at nature and experience it when you, the sensory experience of being deaf and being in nature, and what that means and how you experience it, at least for her. And, I really heard her words and was thinking a lot about it. But my brother and I were always, when we were writing it, wanted just that experience where you start to unwind, and just enough to then wind again. You don't unwind for very long, actually, and there's a very interesting balancing act in the cutting of the film. It's something my incredible editor, Mikkel, who's just like a true north, extremely talented artist, felt so deeply and rhythmically, pushed for. And just that sense of rhythm, the way you get into an act and actually your body starts to do something different. Actually, you start to breathe, and then you stop.
Yeah.
Exactly. There are other moments of nature in the movie where you're not meant to feel that way. So they don't all have the same purpose. There's a shot right before the implant where there's power lines and there's thunder, and that's a static shot of nature that isn't made to make you feel restful. It's actually ominous.
It's interesting because I watched it again last night, and the first time I saw it in a theater where, I don't know if this was by design, but the beginning is incredibly loud. It's like
it's by design.
Yeah. Okay. So obviously, people watching it at home may not have quite this experience, but it is aggressively loud. And then when it gets quiet, the thing it reminded me of is Malik's The New World, when you're in the New World so long that when she gets to London, that even as a modern person who lives in busier cities than that, it seems overwhelming. And I feel like I really admired the way that you were able to take a modern audience and get us to calm down for a minute so that we could kind of start to appreciate that. I think that's one of the things that really—
That's beautiful. That's really beautiful. I love that. And I love the reference of Malik's A Modern World. I think that, or A New World. I think that's really cool. Because I remember that as well. Yeah, that's an ambitious idea, and but really something that we were incredibly interested in, and also, Riz himself was on a very method-like process. So he actually had to go through that while we shot chronologically, which is something I really believe in. Probably the greatest gift to an actor is to shoot chronologically, but especially in this movie, because it's a movie about really going from sound to no sound or different sound, and then back to, it has these three distinct kind of chronological acts. So if you were shifting back and forth and in and out of those, it would be confusing. But we shot chronologically. So, he actually had custom earpieces in his ears that would emit a white noise. And so for much of that experience, he couldn't even hear his own voice. So his process was really very much that, and it was for all of us, because we went from this very frenetic shooting to this incredibly serene place up in Ipswich, and it was just an incredible spot, and so we all had that experience. We were in this house with largely deaf cast, and we would have lunches amongst the deaf community, and it was just an extraordinary experience.
So one thing that's interesting is that the decisions between when we hear from Ruben's perspective and when we hear from outside of Ruben's perspective, or from our perspective, I suppose. How did you make those decisions? Were those things that you kind of knew ahead of time? Were those things that you found in the editing to kind of know, like, when do we as viewers experience the world as Ruben does, and when do we understand it better outside of his head?
Well, both. I mean, it's utterly intentional, written into the script. We always knew we would be doing this. And I had been fixating and geeking out on sound for years. I mean, this sound design started years before the movie was shot. So that's entirely intentional. But then there's the rubber meeting the road, and it's a really ambitious language and a tricky one. So the process is a bit heuristic. And again, it was very interesting, actually, because the sound mix of this movie in post, we think of sound as something that happens in post. We think of it as what happens after picture editing. But in fact, with this film, we needed to do them concurrently. And I have this wonderful sound designer, Nicolas Becker, and he's Parisian. And so, Mikkel and I would be working, and I would actually fly to Paris and work with Nico, and literally sit with him as he mixed sound in order to really determine, does this work, or can we do this? So we would really sound mix as we picture cut, and then and also I will say that Mikkel is incredibly sensitive to sound as well. So he was a wonderful partner in this way, and it was something we always knew we wanted, and then it was about pushing those boundaries and then pulling them back and trying to find that exact kind of balance. Hopefully we came close, because if you overdo it, it's just exhausting, and you have to commit enough, so it's finding that degree of finding the right amount of that doesn't just become an idea.
So we talked a lot about Riz here, but I want to talk about a couple of the other casting decisions. So Olivia Cook, who I should note is also starring in Little Fish, which we're playing tomorrow at the festival.
Oh yeah, great.
Yes.
I haven't seen that. I haven't seen it yet.
You should. She's really good.
Yeah, maybe
was fascinating. So our program director was watching it for the first time last night because she missed it at TIFF, and she was commenting on how every time she shows up, she's different. We've shown Thoroughbreds, we've shown
totally
the Dying Girl. I didn't realize until watching her in Little Fish that she's actually British.
Yeah.
So what was it about her that drew you to her?
Well, she surprised me. I didn't know her. I didn't know her work, and she came in like 3 months, 2-3 months before shooting. So she wasn't attached for a long time, and she just surprised me. I had a meeting with her and saw some really specific things. I knew she was incredibly talented. She's immensely talented. Like, let's talk about someone with instincts. My God. I mean, this person is so talented, just this kind of pure uh, instinct. Um, but she's also really brave. She's just a badass.
Mm.
And she's not, it's always interesting when you talk about bravery, because bravery doesn't mean you're not scared. I always get nervous when I meet with people who aren't scared. What you're looking for is someone who wants to step up into a place of that might not be comfortable. And man, that's Olivia. She showed me that very quickly when we met, and I had an incredibly strong instinct to cast her, and it just took me by surprise. It had nothing to do with her accent or where she was from. It was just about her energy. And then she continued to surprise me as we shot. I mean, this was a woman who was willing to learn, interestingly, like when she's playing music in the beginning, she's looping pedals while playing the guitar and singing. I mean, just that is hard. She worked with this incredible sound artist, Margaret Chardelet, who's in the band Pharmacon. It's a one-woman band. She plays like industrial noise music, and she's awesome. I mean, it's incredible. She's kind of the best at that, at what she does. And she taught Olivia both guitar and kind of how to have that presence, how to scream, which is really hard actually. And Olivia was just down, and she wanted the bleached eyebrows, and all of these things, all those things come from those actors. The same with Liz's tattoos, everything. But with Olivia, it's like she was pissed at me because I didn't show her armpit hair. She's like, what the fuck, I grew that out, and for what? No, but she's just so badass and utterly professional. But that's the least of it. I mean, she just really steps up in a very deep way. So I mean, I feel so honored that she came on, and I'm really happy that we just by chance got to meet each other. That's how these things happen.
That's great. And then Paul, is it Racy?
Paul Racy, yeah.
Paul Racy, who plays Joe. My understanding is he is, although he is not deaf, he is a child of deaf parents.
Yeah, he's what's called CODA, child of deaf adults, and that's a subset of deaf culture, and it's a really interesting one because, first of all, Paul Racy has been an actor for years, and I wouldn't say a struggling actor. He's just not a known actor, but he's been in a lot of things. He lives in LA, and he's but his first language is ASL. He didn't speak English until he maybe 6 years old. He's utterly he grew up and was raised in and by deaf parents, deaf culture. That's what he knows. So it's very interesting when you meet people who are CODAs, because many of them, such as Paul, have spent their childhood kind of as a liaison between the deaf and the hearing worlds, because they're often the kind of intermediary between their parents, sometimes their siblings, and the hearing world. And that's a complicated role. That's a complicated place to be, because you're left with the question, who am I? So the CODAs are this intermediary. And that's one of the things that made Paul so incredibly special for this role, because he is exactly that. He's that intermediary in here. Ruben is a hearing person who suffers, who's late deafened, but in Paul's character, Joe, was also late deafened, and he came to it in the Vietnam War. And then, man, when Paul was casting Joe was really hard, and meeting Paul and seeing this guy's a 2-time Vietnam vet himself, and he's taught deaf AA groups, and it's just like, you can't imagine the feeling of meeting the character you wrote. It's like unbelievable. That guy is the real deal.
I think it's interesting that he kind of embodied things you wrote. The scene when he has to tell Ruben to leave is heartbreaking. It's so he's so incredible. And it's, you know, like you would, it seems like, you know, you would have written the role for him, but that's clearly not the case.
I wrote it for him. I just hadn't met him yet.
Wow.
It really is like that. I cried in every single take of that while we were shooting. It's so, the emotion's so palpable. And part of the reason for that is, and it gets back to what I was saying about the caretaker. You know, codas are often caretakers. They're caretakers. You know, my heart just went out to the many codas that I met, because many of them are interpreters, and they're caretakers. And they, you know, Paul is exactly that. He's watching his flock, you know, they're in his charge. And Paul knows that experience within the world of his deaf family, and he knows that experience from the army. He knows what it is when you have a weak link in the Navy and you can't let that weak link sink the boat. You know, what Paul was, the things Paul was working on, I would think of, sometimes I think with actors, it's like a garden. You have this garden of treasures that are your own, that you can pull from. If you don't have the things in the garden, you can't pull from it. You know, they're either there or they're not. For that man, for Paul as Joe, but for Paul to ask Reuben to leave was so heartbreaking for him in real time, so heartbreaking for him, that it broke my heart every single time he did it. It still breaks my heart thinking about him doing it, because it was real. I mean, he was really, every time it broke his heart, you know. And yeah, it's a moment of extraordinary truth on the camera, on the screen. It really is. And you know, it's really just an honor to have witnessed it, truly.
So I definitely want to talk about making films in Massachusetts, but we do have a couple questions that I want to get to, so that I don't.
I'm so glad, because, you know, these things are so often pre-taped, and it's awesome to be live. It's like real life. It's almost like real life.
All right. So one question is, if it was an artistic choice not to caption the ASL in the film.
Was it an artistic choice? Everything's an artistic choice. So yes, if it's not captioned, you better believe it's artistic. Otherwise, it's just a mistake. No, I'm kidding. The experience, like we were talking about earlier, it's a very committed first-person experience, and we go on this journey with Reuben. So when we hear what Reuben hears, and we feel what he feels a lot of the time, hopefully, if you're with the movie. And when you go into the deaf community, he doesn't know ASL. And one of my rules in the making of this film, and the cutting of this film, is never to be smarter than Reuben as an audience. We don't want to know more than Reuben. And another aspect of not captioning the ASL that's really incredible, having you were in Toronto, and this is an interesting thing. It's unfortunate that maybe we won't have as much of a theatrical experience as we might have, but I mean, it will be in theaters, but we know the world we're living in. The film is open captioned, so obviously deaf and hearing people can all watch the same film. And in Toronto, when we premiered it, we had a lot of deaf people in the audience. And what was amazing is that while those scenes are occurring, you hear this laughter from the deaf community. And for once, a hearing audience is the minority. And that's how it's supposed to feel. You get to be the minority for once when you watch those scenes, and it doesn't become captioned until Reuben understands it.
Right. That's great. Okay, so we have another question about the cost of implants. Let me get the actual wording here. Can you speak to the cost of cochlear implants? We know so many folks who are hearing impaired, and so few have the ability to pay. I know it's also.
Well, I will say, there's, just as it relates to cochlear implants, there's so much nuance to it, and it's a moving target. So, like, keep in mind, this film was written many years ago now. And I do think some of these details have changed. We're also very much aware of a lot of details about the cochlear process that is not on the screen. The first meeting with the audiologist, I think when we cut that together, I think that was like 45 minutes long. We had so much information in there. And obviously we don't have the time to do all of that. There's a very in-depth process with this whole thing that isn't on the screen. But as far as the cost of it, at the time, that was the range. And at the time, they weren't really covered by insurance. I've talked to some audiologists since who tell me that, in fact, they often are now. So I acknowledge that may be true, or it may be true in some situations or with some insurance. We all know how that goes. So I think that was the accurate information that we had then.
I mean, it's unlikely that a grindcore drummer would have insurance anyways. So
that's another piece of it. Yeah. I'm just going to turn a light on here.
But it's obviously touched on, from what Joe says, but I've seen the documentary The Sound and the Fury, which talks about, and this is obviously a few years, so things may have changed, but certainly at that time, cochlear implants were quite controversial.
And they still are. I mean, it's still there's a lot of controversy, and you can understand why. I mean, there's not an easy answer there, and the film doesn't attempt to answer that. It's really not my place. It really just puts it out there. I mean, it speaks to the truth of Reuben.
Right.
Well, although one thing I will say about the implants and the experience of the sound of implants, I listened to a lot of kind of approximations of that sound, simulations of that sound, is that if anything, the movie is easier than what would happen in reality. I think in reality, if I had actually accurately depicted it, it would have been unbearable.
All right, let me pivot a little bit to filming in Massachusetts. I'll be honest, when I saw the movie, I didn't realize it was shot in Massachusetts until I saw the Bernie and Phil sign. I'm like, wait, that's not.
That's great. So, well, you're not meant to think it's in Massachusetts.
Clearly. But can you talk a little bit about shooting in Massachusetts and, what you found there and what that added and the ability to make Massachusetts look like,
the whole country?
Yeah, basically. So congratulations to you and to Lisa.
Well, yeah, exactly. No, well, first of all, I'm from Mass. I don't know if you know that, but so it was a real joy to shoot, this film here. It was kind of a nice coincidence because it had the proper tax incentives, and you were able to make the case for it. But then for me, when I was writing the movie, like the diner scene, I had a particular diner that I set that in my mind. That was a diner in Massachusetts, in my case, Western Mass, because that's where I'm from. But to be able to come to Mass and make this film with Chris Stinson, who's, and by the way, Chris was involved way back, like even before I got the current producers. Chris and I were on such a journey with this movie. Almost shot it in Mass once before. And I mean, I think it took us 4 years to find the location where Joe's house is. It was just like, it took such a long time, specifically because it had to be in a certain distance to your offices for tax reasons. And so it also had to feel completely in the middle of nowhere. So that location is not that far from Boston, actually, but it really feels like you're in the middle of nowhere. Right. But shooting in Massachusetts was such a joy. I mean, I remember like the first day, the Teamsters were all huddled up, and I walked over to them and I said, guys, I know what you're thinking, but just don't even start with me because I'm from Massachusetts. So don't even try it. Guys, like, oh yeah, where are you from? And I was like, what do you mean? I'm from Massachusetts. Now, what part of Massachusetts are you from? I was like, I'm from Western Mass. Yeah, I never heard of it. I was like, oh man, here we go.
That's great. I mean, I love, obviously I love seeing films made here. I love that it doesn't, again, if it weren't for the Burning Phil sign, I never would have known. So I love that.
How about the Agawam Diner?
See, I don't know the Agawam Diner.
Oh, come on now. You've got to go to the Agawam Diner. I'm going to put a plug in for the Agawam Diner.
Please do.
No, that place is amazing. I fought so hard to shoot in that diner. It was probably our most expensive location. And not because those guys, they run a family diner and they had to close it, you know? Yeah. So that's the deal. It was like, but it's such a phenomenal location, you know? And yeah, it was such a joy to shoot here.
Yeah, so I mean that's a note to any filmmakers out there. Massachusetts can look like everywhere, so come shoot here.
Right. Well, that's absolutely true, and not true of every state. I mean, we really, you know, the cornfields, the sense of scope. Mass really does have this incredibly diverse landscape. You can have. We almost went to mountains. You have the ocean. You know, it really, and then you have the city, and then you have this urban landscape. We shot in Lynn, shot in Boston. The hospital was in Boston, you know. So yeah, there's like a ton that you can get right from this very small area right around Greater Boston. Amazing.
Right. So I guess we're kind of coming up on time, but I want to I guess first I should say that if you're watching this and you have not yet seen Sound of Metal, we are playing it at the festival through Monday morning, November 2nd. So please do that. And then after that, I know Amazon has some plans for it. Can you share those with the viewers? What after the festival run, what the release plan is?
Well, we're releasing in theaters. Remember those things? You go with other people.
Very well.
It's weird. You sit in seats. I don't know. It's weird. But they were doing that on November 20th, and then we're streaming on December 4th.
Great.
On Prime, and. You know, I would just ask people, if you're going to wait and watch, if you're going to watch it when it's streaming, do it with headphones. Yeah, I think that's unless you have an awesome sound system, but I don't want to assume you do. Yeah, and play it loud. Yeah, I mean, the sound mix of this movie took 23 weeks, and it's meant to be really listened to. It's a ridiculously ambitious sound mix, so play it loud.
Well, Darius, thank you so much for joining us. Also, Sophia, thank you for your help. Everybody go watch Sound of Metal, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much. So fun. Talk to you soon.
All right, great.